Shadowdark. Really for beginners and experts, not so much for middlings. Today on RPG Boons.
Evil is equals Dragonball. Lesser, greater, middling.
4 Annies later, is Shadowdark better than Dungeons and Dragons? And do we care about those 4 Annies? We just want to play a game, we want to fight some monsters and feel like we're in one of those Lord of the Rings movies. So today what we're going to do is we're going to compare Shadowdark with Dungeons and Dragons 5e mechanics and show you what the differences are between the two and really show that it's really more for beginners and experienced people, because those who want a little more information are going to really struggle with Shadowdark, but those that are experts will easily be able to follow everything that's in the book. Now let's look at an overall summary of the two different games. It's $59 for a textbook, plus you can get that PDF on top of that for $59, or $29 for just the PDF alone. Now, when you look at the D&D 5e book, even the new one, it's $50, plus you must get that Dungeon Master's Guide, or you probably will. It has all the magic items as well as other useful things. And the monster manual. We need monsters. I showed in a previous video that player's handbook creature appendix in the back, just it's not really good, and it doesn't really give you good villains to work with. So you definitely have to get a monster manual of some kind. The other thing I've noticed about Shadowdark is it looks just like 1E Dungeons and Dragons, but it uses some 5e mechanics to really kind of update the system. It's also good for beginners, really good for experts. But for people in the middle, it might kind of disappoint you because you might need a little more information. Now, when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons 5e, it's the name brand. Everybody wants to play Dungeons & Dragons, and so therefore that's probably why you want to buy it.
Maybe I'm wrong on this one, but for me, the beast doesn't include selling out.
And when we think about Shadowdark, it's basically a player's handbook and a Dungeon and Master's Guide and the monster manual combined. And again, if you want to play D&D 5e, you really have to get a monster manual of some kind. That Dungeon Master's Guide is not necessarily very important, but it does have some helpful tips. So first, let's go ahead and look at some of those very, very basic mechanics, dice, stuff like that, and then we'll slowly start building on top of that. Now, when we think about those dice, when we compare D&D 5e and Shadowdark, they're both using all the same standard dice. When we think about those bonuses, we know that in 5e, we get all these different ability bonuses, proficiency bonuses, the advantage, disadvantage, as well as you can really buff a character, right? The Bard can give you up to a 1d12 inspiration dice. Now, when we look at Shadowdark, they have the ability bonuses, they have advantage and disadvantage, but the buffs are extremely low. When I was looking through that spell list, they only have Bless, and Bless gives you a luck point, which is essentially a reroll. And that's it. There's no more other buffs. When it comes to targeting, such as ACs or DCs are essentially identical. The numbers are a little bit different. We'll show that a little bit later. HP, the HP is reduced in Shadowdark versus Dungeons and Dragons. You can see here the numbers. And recovery are essentially the same. Now, when we think about the actions that you want to take in D&D versus Shadowdark, you can see that in D&D 5e, there's free actions, but you also have this move, this bonus action, reactions, no multi-attack penalty, but you can definitely attack multiple times, and that critical hit does ×2 damage. Now, if we look at Shadowdark, there is free actions. It's just something that you can do similar to Dungeons and Dragons, and pretty nicely, a free action is drinking a thing such as drinking a potion. Now, when we look at the actions, there's only 2 actions you can really take in Shadowdark. The move and the actions that'll be listed. It's usually a ranged attack, cast a spell, melee attack, but there's no other additional attack. So you just have move and 1 attack, and they do allow you to do kind of like a dash action, which means you can move twice if you really want to. No multi-attack, and still the ×2 damage in Shadowdark. Now, when it comes to initiative, it's very similar to Dungeons & Dragons 5e.
No, hold on.
It's dex-based, but, in D&D 5e, depending on what people rolled around the table, you kind of point over here, you point over there, who got the next highest score. However, in Shadowdark, everybody rolls, but as soon as the highest roll is established, it basically goes clockwise, and that's it. So it'll be interesting, because essentially what you want to do is set up your table where everybody sits in a manner that you'd normally want to arrange your attackers, your ranged attacks, your healers, and essentially that's a good way to go around it. Now, that first round is going to kind of suck in a sense that if you fall in somewhere like the healer goes first, then the monster gets to attack immediately. But as soon as that monster's done attacking, it just goes back to order. You usually have your ranged attacks, your barbarians, and then you can get your priests or clerics to heal your players essentially after that, and then it starts again with the monsters. Now, the next thing I like to do is I like to look at those character sheets, because I think those character sheets really give you an insight on how complicated the game system might be. So if we look at Shadowdark, you can see it's very simplified. HP, attacks, gear, all that stuff, very limited amount of space, not too much to keep track of. Now, if you look at the D&D 5e, way more things to check off, way more skills to think about, as well as a lot of more equipment and proficiencies and stuff like that you got to keep track of, as well as bonds and deals and flaws and things such as that. And I think that gives you an idea of how complicated the two systems might be. Now here we're just taking a closer look at those ability scores. You can see that essentially in Shadowdark and D&D have the identical ability scores, but they've essentially removed all those different skills, so you don't really have to keep track of that in Shadowdark. Now you can see here with the ability scores are essentially identical Dungeons and Dragons when you look at those modifiers, and when it comes to giving out those ability scores to the different attributes, you can see in Shadowdark it's a 3d6 for every single one. You don't subtract anything. But again, this is kind of what makes Shadowdark kind of nice, is it's really of a backbone system, so you can actually take other systems and use those different techniques in other systems and use them in Shadowdark. But in Shadowdark it's 3d6, and if you don't hit one stat, that's 14. You can essentially just re-roll another die until you get that 14, or re-roll those 3d6 until you get a 14. And we know all about Dungeons and Dragons 5e. There's a standard array, the 46 with the -1d6. Now, when it comes to difficulty class, clearly Dungeons and Dragons has a difficulty class of up to 30. That's nearly impossible to do. And they do this because in Dungeons and Dragons, there's a lot of proficiency bonuses, and your strength and ability scores can be much, much higher. And in addition, there's all those buffs, right? Like I mentioned earlier, the Bard can give you a 1d12 inspiration die. And if we look at Shadowdark, you can see the difficulty classes are at 9, 12, 15, and 18. Again, that's because none of those real buffs exist in Shadowdark. Now, when it comes to those ancestries, we can see here that it really takes only 2 pages to describe the ancestry and races in Shadowdark, right? If we look at the D&D 5e character player's handbook, you can see that between pages of 17 and 42, there's a description of all the different races, all the different places they're from, the backgrounds, the places they might have grown up, a lot of their race personality traits essentially. Now, if you look at Shadowdark and compare those ability score bonuses or all those different racial traits that you get in Dungeons and Dragons, you can see that this is literally all the attribute bonuses you're going to get in Shadowdark. There's, obviously dwarf, elf, goblin, half-orc, halfling, and human. But you can see the bonuses are very, very simplified compared to Dungeons and Dragons, where you get these ability score improvement bonuses, but you also going to get all these other different things that come with it. Right here, we're looking at a halfling. They give you a little more description about their alignment, what they could be, their size, their speed, lucky, brave, halfling, nimbleness. All these things are extra things that come with the halfling. And if you look at the halfling in Shadowdark, once per day you can become invisible for 3 rounds, right? So there's a clear difference. It's really distilled in Shadowdark, and it just doesn't give you the level of detail you're going to get in Dungeons and Dragons, and the power level is going to be decreased as well. When it comes to those classes, you can see that there's only 4 classes in Shadowdark: fighter, priest, thief, wizard, and their description is essentially only in 2 pages. Now, I'll show you a little bit of the pages, but essentially in cases such as a fighter, it's really all in 1 page, as well as the thief, it's in 1 page, where in the priest and the wizard, they have to put a little more space because they require a spell slot level kind of chart there for you to look at. Now, when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, again, just look at the page numbers on the top there. It's 46 to the wizard, 112. It just shows you the level of detail and description they're going to give you in the player's handbook. This is looking at the 2014, but this is very similar to the 2024, which I have over here, of course. Oops, I have flown out my name. And the other thing to think about is there's no subclasses in Shadowdark. You're just a fighter, a priest, a thief, and a wizard. Where we know in Dungeons and Dragons, every single class, at least in the player's handbook, has around 2 to 3 different subclasses with, again, more abilities and details that you can do. Now, this is the thing I mentioned earlier. This is what makes Shadowdark kind of a backbone style type of RPG system, because if you really want to steal from any system, not just Dungeons and Dragons, let's just say, Pathfinder or Dungeon Crawl Classics, any of that stuff you want to take, it's really easy to incorporate into Shadowdark because it's such a bare bones kind of system. Now, when it comes to backgrounds, we can see here the Shadowdark backgrounds. Again, One page, look at that, page 26, and then the very next thing is they go to alignment, and they only give you these little brief descriptions of every single background, and essentially between you and the dungeon master, he's going to decide whether or not you're going to get advantage for certain things that happen based on your background, really simplifying the system. And we know that in Dungeons and Dragons, not just here in the 2014 that I'm showing, but even in the 2024, they give you a lot more to work with, right? There's skill proficiencies, tool proficiencies. They tell you some basic equipment that you might come with, or gold pieces, as well as they tell you ways to play that background. Now, when it comes to the new player's handbook, as everybody knows, you also get those ability score improvements there instead of in the race, but it's basically the same thing. You get them with the race or you get them with the background, it really doesn't matter. I will say, though, that in the new player's handbook, they really took away a lot of that extra background, so really allowing the player to really come up with the backstory. When it comes to gaining levels in Shadowdark, you can see at level 1, you need 10 XP to gain a level. That seems extremely low compared to Dungeons & Dragons, which takes up to 355,000 to get to 20th level, or even 64,000 to get to 5th level, right? So this really tells you that the way that XP is given out in Shadowdark is a little more constricted. It's a little more confined, and you're basically not going to get that much XP after every single adventure. Now, that might seem a little low or a little non-rewarding for some players, and I get that. But
Wait a minute. What's this? This ain't enough.
But, you know, if it only takes you 10 XP to gain a level, it's not that big of a deal. And you can see when you get these advancements, you're going to get these talents. Now, the talents are nothing like the talents in Tales of the Valiant or the feats in Dungeons and Dragons. I'll show you some examples of that. It's really simplified ways for your characters to improve and do better at their abilities or gain ability score improvements. Now, when it comes to the HP, you can see that the HP in Shadowdark is a lot less. You initially get that Constitution bonus modifier with your HP when you start, but thereafter you only get a hit dice. Now, we know that in Dungeons and Dragons, every single time you not only get that hit dice, you get to add your Constitution modifier on top of that. So you know that those HP, we know that HP can go up to like 360, which I noted earlier. The alignment system, we just briefly talked about it, but it's super simplified. Again, just look at it here. It's in one page. They tell you what these 3 different alignments are. You're either one of those where where in D&D 5e, they really try to chop up those 3 different types of alignments and really kind of, make it a little bit more complicated. So again, because Shadowdark is such a bare bones kind of a system, you can use D&D 5e alignment system if you want. We saw in that XP chart that you get +1 talent like every other level. You can see here is a list of all the different talents for the different classes. And you can see that the improvements you get are very limited, right? If we look over here at the fighter, you roll somewhere between a 7 and a 9. Basically, every time you get a talent, you roll this 2d6. And if you get a 7 or 9, you get a +2 to your strength, dexterity, or constitution. That kind of is what allows you to add the flavor to the class, right? If you want to be more of a barbarian or more of a ranger style type of fighter, you just put it to the appropriate ability score, essentially. Now, we know that in Dungeons and Dragons, after not only are you getting those hit points and you're getting all those different subclass features also when you're gaining levels, but then in addition, there's feats that you can pick up in Dungeons and Dragons as well. So again, you can still use some of those feats and transfer them over to Shadowdark if you want to start upping the power in your game. Now, when it comes to multi-classing, we know you can multi-class in Dungeons and Dragons. They do say ask your dungeon master before you do that, and it should, I think, make sense for the story and your character. But a lot of times people ignore that and just kind of want a power game, which is fine. I like to power game, but I also like to make sure my players are, making sense of why they're getting to multi-class into something else. And Shadowdark just does not have multi-classing. Like, I guess you could use talents from each, from the different classes to try to multi-class, but that's something you'd really have to dig into and try to look at to see what would be a fair way to do it. Now, when it comes to the weapon damage, this is something that's pretty universal across all Dungeons and Dragons editions. The weapon damages are about the same. I like to point at like the Bastard Sword, which essentially is similar to the Longsword in Dungeons and Dragons. Now, you can see that the Bastard Sword, which means you can hold it with one hand or 2 hands, is that versatile option that you get from Dungeons and Dragons. The damages are about the same, 1d8, 1 to 10. And if you look down here at the dagger, it's going to do 1d4 damage, same as it's going to do in Dungeons and Dragons. And again, these damage are the same from 1E all the way to 5th edition, so it doesn't really matter. Now we know that in Dungeons and Dragons they have these weapon masteries, as well as Tales of the Valiants have these weapons options, but essentially because Shadowdark again is so bare bones, you can just essentially steal some of these and put them into your game. When it comes to armor class and what you get from those, again, they simplified it. There's a lot less different types of armors, but if you look at those ACs, you can see that a chainmail over here is 13, leather armor 11, really simplified armor, plate armor 15, not as good as the 18 that you get from Dungeons and Dragons, but what are you gonna do? And a simple +2 for the shield. Now, when it comes to the encumbrance, I think it's kind of interesting. Shadowdark went into this whole video game style type of encumbrance system, right? Like in Dungeons and Dragons, it's a little more complicated. You have to multiply, blah, 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 blah. Maybe you don't want to do that, but what Shadowdark does is they create gear slots. Now, this is very similar to what we see in Minecraft, which I play from time to time, and Diablo 2. Here's an image of that, which is something I used to play tons of back in the day. But you can see that there's different types of gear slots. So in Shadowdark, they have a limited amount of gear slots that you can have, gear slots that are equal to 10 or your strength or higher, whatever is higher.
Nothing else matters.
Now, when it comes to the treasure, Shadowdark has lots of magic items and treasure and armor inside of it. I think this is what's going to push it and excel it above just getting the player's handbook and then just buying one book, and kind of one book plays everything. No magic items in the D&D 5e, not even in the 2024, not in the 2014. There's just no magic items in those books. Now, when it comes to casting magic, I actually am not a fan of making you roll to cast a spell, and if the spell doesn't work, something bad happens to you. And that's kind of what they do here in Shadowdark. I mean, there is a critical success, which is nice, but the critical failures, it's up to you. Some people like that randomness and dangerousness of using magic, but I personally don't. But, when it comes to Shadowdark, you can see it's just very easy. You roll a dice and you cast a spell, and then you read what the effects are. Where in Dungeons and Dragons, there is some die rolling, usually either by yourself or the players if it's a save. But here's just kind of an example looking at Flame Blade, where, there's the verbal, somatic, and material components of a spell. So what we're looking at here is we're just looking at some of the popular spells from Dungeons and Dragons and comparing those to what's in Shadowdark. You can see, the descriptions are a lot briefer in Shadowdark, but it's also just simplified, right? The duration is instant. There's range, and that's it. You don't see, verbal, somatic, material. None of that stuff's in there. And you can see in some cases the damages are reduced, making it a lot easier, right? So here's the next set of popular spells. We're looking at Fireball and Shield. Fireball essentially does 46 damage rather than this total of 86 damage, so half the amount of damage. There really is no shield spell in Shadowdark, but they have this stone skin that kind of resembles the shield spell. The shield spell gives you a +5 to your AC. You cast stone skin, you essentially have armor class of 17, right? So, or a 20 on that critical check there. So again, very similar. Now, when it comes to inspiration or those boons or bonuses you get in Dungeons and Dragons, where you get to, essentially get a reroll, Shadowdark has something very similar, but you only can keep one. They're called luck tokens, and essentially you get a reroll. Well, what's kind of cool is you can actually give away your luck tokens. So if you're doing really well and somebody's struggling really bad, you can actually give that to another player and improve their chances of survival or hitting or anything like that. But again, a lot of times, similar to Dungeons and Dragons, sometimes it's up to the DM to decide who's going to get the luck tokens or the inspiration. And I'm just not a fan of that. I really like when you make a roll similar to Tales of the Valiant or Daggerheart, where the roll actually decides who's going to get the different types of bonuses, such as inspirations or boons and stuff like that. Now, a couple things I want to talk about in terms of when it comes to Shadowdark is the concept of time. So Shadowdark really goes to the 1E system, where they really want you to keep track of time in real time, and that's kind of whatever's happening happening during your game is actual real time. And they copy that here in Shadowdark, and it really becomes important when you're thinking about torches and stuff like that. The torches themselves only have a limited amount of time that they're on, and eventually you always have to keep track of when the torch is going out before you have no more torches. Let's say you only go down to a dungeon with 20 torches, and you might be in trouble down the road. Now, the other really huge bonus about Shadowdark, which again, for $59 you get the book and you get the PDF, is that it is a Dungeon Master's Guide and a monster manual all in one, right? And here what we're looking at are just those pages. So if you look at Shadowdark, the Game Master section is from page 101 all the way to 187. That's 80 pages of Dungeon Master material that you get in Shadowdark. It's really nice. They give you tons of charts for maps, for different types of cities, things to do, balancing encounters. All these different things are in Shadowdark, which really make it a valuable buy. Just very quickly, we can see just some of the charts that are in there. I don't want to get any type of copyright infringement, but we can see there's a lot of cool stuff that it provides you. Now, the other thing that's very important for Shadowdark is it gives you a good amount of monsters. Again, looking at here at the table on the left, page 187, it ends at 267. That's a lot of monsters. Not only just monsters, but there's ways to design monsters with a few pages at the end there. Now, when it comes to the Player's Handbook, there's 31 creatures and monsters in the back. I believe the new Player's Handbook has around 52, if I can remember correctly, 56, something like that. Some of the monsters are like giant eagles, giant spiders. There's an imp, there's a falcon. You do get some skeletons, so you can play a little bit of a Game of Thrones style type of game. But if we look at Shadowdark here, you're going to get those dragons, you're going to get some drow, you're going to get a manticore, you're going to get a terrace, you're going to get a giant were-rat, a werewolf, a white, and that's it, everybody. That's Shadowdark versus Dungeons and Dragons. And I think what I've shown you is that Shadowdark really does not have a lot of details, which I think if you're the kind of person who just really wants to jump in and play a very simplified game, Shadowdark is the way to go. It does have all that information for dungeon masters. It also has all those monsters. It has all those magic items, where you're not going to get any of that stuff in the Player's Handbook, but you're going to get a lot more detail for the classes, the races, ways you want to play them. We know that with the new Player's Handbook 2024, they kind of diversified the way the different races might exist, but in the 2014, you can really just focus on playing the races the way you would find them in Lord of the Rings. So I think Shadowdark is really good for people who don't have a lot of experience and really just want to kind of get to the game and play it and actually use those Dungeon Master sections to really build on their campaign. But it's also really good for people who are very experienced dungeon masters, because me looking at this stuff, it's really easy for me to fill in all the text that's not there, right? I already know a lot about Dungeons and Dragons, the lore behind monsters and world building, encounter building, all the information, at least I perceive to be what a dwarf is, what an elf is. All that stuff is missing in Shadowdark, but you're definitely going to get that stuff in Dungeons and Dragons. That's why I say that I really think Shadowdark is for beginners and experts. But if you're somewhere in the middle and you really want to build more information or get more information or need more detail about all those kinds of things, you're just not going to get them in Shadowdark. And that's it, everybody. I'm Don Franco 3. This is RPG Boons, where we talk about everything RPG and how everything is RP. If you'd like to cut out my gibberish, please hit the subscribe button. Leave a comment. I'll get back to you. Until then, good luck buying those games.